When I first received the invitation to that dinner, I believed it would be a gentle crossing of a threshold, a chance to sit at a table not only as his girlfriend, but as someone accepted by the circle that mattered most to him. It was presented to me as a celebration, something simple, warm, casual even, but beneath the surface I understood its weight. Meeting friends in passing is one thing, but being invited to sit down at the same table, to share a meal, is always a test cloaked in laughter and wine. I prepared myself with a sense of cautious optimism, the way one does before entering a room where unspoken judgments often masquerade as jokes, and where alliances are tested not by words of affection, but by glances exchanged when someone leaves the table. I wanted to belong, to prove that his choice of me was not a matter of whimsy, but something stable, valuable, and deserving of recognition. The restaurant was neither overly elegant nor casual. It had that curated air of being both accessible and exclusive, with dim lighting and chatter that filled the air like smoke. I remember my dress, simple and understated, chosen deliberately not to appear as though I was trying too hard. I could already hear in my head the comments that women imagine when they know they are about to be scrutinized. Too much, too little, trying to impress, doesn't even care. So I stood in front of my mirror earlier that evening, brushing the fabric with my hand, telling myself that I was not dressing for them, not for their verdict, but for my own comfort. It was a lie I needed to believe. He looked at me when I met him outside the place, and his smile reassured me. He kissed my cheek softly and whispered that I looked beautiful, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. We walked inside, hand in hand, and I imagined the night unfolding with gentle introductions, shared jokes, perhaps a toast or two to something vague like new chapters. But as soon as I saw the table, the way his friends were already seated, clustered around the best friend who had that magnetic presence people either admire or secretly resent, I knew this would not be a simple evening. There was a hierarchy there, an invisible structure built over years of shared history, of nights drinking together, of secrets exchanged, and I was stepping into it as an outsider, someone whose value was not yet recognized. The greetings were polite, some even warm. A few smiled genuinely, asking me questions about my work, my family, my interests. But the center of the table, the one who drew all conversations back to himself like a tide pulling in the loose debris of a beach, was his best friend. He had the confidence of someone who had never been denied space, who filled silences not because he feared them, but because he assumed they belonged to him by right. He leaned back in his chair with that careless ease, a glass of red wine in his hand, eyes scanning everything like he was perpetually amused, perpetually superior. At first, the dinner unfolded in a predictable rhythm. Menus were read, orders were made, waiters weaved in and out of the circle, and small talk carried us through the first course. I remember trying to hold myself with poise, to not interrupt, but also to not fade into the background. My laughter came at the right moments, my words careful, not forced. I was performing, though not dishonestly. I wanted them to see the real me, but I also knew the real me would be too easily dismissed if I did not choose which parts to show. In those moments, every gesture felt calculated, not because I was insincere, but because I was aware of the weight of perception, the way one evening can seal the way a group remembers you forever. And yet, beneath all that carefulness, there was a fragile excitement. I watched him, the man I loved, smiling as his friends teased him, and I thought that perhaps soon I too would be included in those stories, that perhaps they would remember this dinner as the night they first welcomed me as more than an outsider. But what I did not know then was that the very structure of the evening, its laughter, its toasts, and even its carefully poured glasses of wine, was already leaning toward a moment designed not to include me, but to test me, to mark me either as strong enough to survive their scrutiny or weak enough to be dismissed. By the time the main dishes arrived, there was already a rhythm of wine refills and louder voices. Jokes had become bolder, conversations more personal. I noticed how his best friend kept returning his attention to me, not with genuine curiosity, but with that sharp-edged amusement that seeks weakness. He asked questions that seemed polite but carried undertones, questions that forced me to justify myself, to prove that I was worthy of sitting there. I answered each one with calmness, with grace, but I could feel the game being played. He was not searching for knowledge. He was digging for cracks. The moment when everything turned, though, was not loud, not theatrical. It was quiet, slipped in between bites of food and the clinking of forks against plates. The best friend, with a smile that was both lazy and cruel, leaned back and said the words that would freeze the air in my lungs. "He could do so much better than you." It was spoken not as an outburst, but as a casual observation, like one might comment on the weather or the flavor of wine. And because it was spoken that way, without hesitation, without shame, it cut deeper. I felt the world narrow in that instant. The chatter around me blurred. The laughter of others seemed distant, and all I could hear was the echo of those words. They were not just an insult to me. They were an insult to the man I loved, too, disguised as advice. But what struck me even more than the cruelty of the statement was the silence that followed it. My boyfriend did not speak. He did not defend me, did not challenge his friend. He just sat there, eyes flickering, lips pressed together, as though the words had tied him down. And in that silence, I understood something fundamental. I was alone in that moment, and every pair of eyes at the table was waiting to see how I would react. I did not cry. I did not lower my eyes. Instead, I took a slow sip of water, placed my glass back down, and smiled. Not at him, not at his friend, but at the moment itself. I smiled because I realized that humiliation, once accepted, becomes power. And I decided that this dinner, which was supposed to be a celebration, would mark something very different. It would be the beginning of a silent game I would not lose. The sentence still echoed in my head long after it was spoken, though the sound of clinking glasses and cutlery around us carried on as though nothing had happened. "He could do so much better than you." It was not shouted, not even delivered with malice obvious enough for others to gasp at. It was dropped into the air as if it were a casual truth, a careless observation stated aloud without consequence. That was what made it all the more devastating. It was delivered with the weight of normality, as if no one at the table should have disagreed, as if the remark belonged naturally to the conversation. For a few heartbeats I sat frozen, my hands resting lightly on the edge of my plate, my posture carefully balanced between composure and collapse. I could feel the blood rushing to my face, heat crawling up my neck, yet my expression did not betray what was happening inside me. I knew every eye at the table was watching, some pretending not to, others reveling in the discomfort, and I understood that the next breath, the next gesture, would define me more than any polite answer I had given earlier in the evening. I glanced briefly at him, the man I had come there to support, the one whose presence had steadied me as we walked in, and I found nothing in his eyes. They were cast downward, his lips pressed into a line, his silence speaking volumes that the cruel words themselves had not. It was not that he agreed. I could see he did not. It was that he did not know how to challenge it, or worse, did not dare to. That silence cut deeper than the insult itself. If his best friend felt free enough to humiliate me in public, and he felt unable to defend me, then what did that mean about the foundation we were building? The room around me began to feel smaller, voices muffled as though I were underwater, yet I forced myself to remain present, to breathe evenly, to hold my gaze steady on my glass of water as though it were the most fascinating object in the world. The silence that followed his comment was not empty. It was thick, charged, full of unspoken judgments. Some of the others shifted uncomfortably, forks scratching against plates as they pretended to find solace in their food. A few exchanged glances, tight-lipped and knowing, as if this kind of cruelty was not unusual from him, the best friend who always claimed the right to speak the truth no matter the wound it caused. One of the women at the far end of the table cleared her throat softly, perhaps in an attempt to change the subject, but the damage was already done. The words hung above us like smoke, and everyone could smell the burn. In that moment, I wanted desperately to vanish, to stand and leave, to let my absence answer the insult better than any retort could. But I knew that would give him exactly what he wanted. His words were a test, not only of me, but of my place in this relationship. If I left in tears or anger, it would confirm to everyone that I did not belong there, that I was fragile, temporary, replaceable. So I sat still, spine straight, my face arranged in a calm neutrality I did not feel. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down again with deliberate grace, a movement so controlled that it silenced even the small side conversations that had begun to rise. I did not speak, but in my silence I made a choice. I would not let humiliation define me. I would remember every detail, every look, every smirk, and I would build something stronger from it. The rest of the dinner unfolded in a haze. Conversations picked up again, stilted and awkward at first, then flowing more easily as though the comment had been absorbed into the background noise. But I could feel the shift in me. I no longer heard their words as mere small talk. I was analyzing, recording, measuring. I watched the way his best friend laughed, throwing his head back, confident that he had reinforced his dominance. I noticed how my boyfriend forced a smile, trying to move forward, his hand brushing mine under the table as though that small gesture could erase the silence he had allowed to stretch like a canyon between us. I noted the way others avoided my eyes, unwilling to be complicit, yet unwilling to stand against the weight of his words. Every detail etched itself into my memory, not as pain, but as evidence. Later, when dessert was served and wine glasses were refilled, I forced myself to join in, to laugh lightly at stories, to show that I had not been broken. I played the part of the gracious guest, and in doing so, I regained control of the narrative. If anyone had expected me to sulk, to withdraw, to lash out, they were disappointed. My silence was not surrender, it was strategy. The comment that was supposed to reduce me instead crystallized something inside me. I saw the battlefield for what it was. Not a dinner, not a celebration, but an arena where power was tested and alliances revealed. I would not forget how his best friend had positioned himself as the judge, nor would I forget how the man I loved had failed to raise his voice in my defense. When we finally left the restaurant, the night air hit my face with a clarity I had been craving. He slipped his arm around me as though nothing had happened, his words soft, almost apologetic, but still evasive. "You know how he is," he murmured, as though that explained everything. I smiled faintly and nodded, because in that moment I understood better than he did. Yes, I did know how his friend was. Arrogant, cruel, used to controlling every dynamic he entered. And now I knew something else too. I would never forgive the words he had spoken, nor the silence that had followed. That night, lying awake beside him, I replayed every second in my head. The insult had torn through the silence of that dinner like a blade, but it had also given me something unexpected. It had given me clarity. I saw now that I was not only fighting for acceptance, not only struggling to prove I belonged. I was standing at the edge of a line that had been drawn for me without my consent, and I had a choice to make. I could stay behind it, diminished and humiliated, or I could step across it with purpose, carrying every ounce of composure I had left. What I decided in that sleepless hour was simple. The game had begun, and I would play it better than any of them had imagined. What haunted me most after that dinner was not the cruelty of his best friend's remark, sharp and cutting as it had been, but the absence of any sound that should have followed it. I had not expected a scene, nor for him to slam his hand on the table in outrage, but I had thought, foolishly perhaps, that love carries with it a reflex, that instinctive defense that rises without calculation when someone you care for is attacked. Yet when those words, "He could do so much better than you," settled into the air, my eyes instinctively searched for his, and what I found there was not fire, but hesitation, not protest but restraint. And in that hesitation, something inside me shifted. It was as if I had been watching a tower I trusted suddenly lean under the weight of a storm, not crumbling completely, but cracking enough that I could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone. That look of his, it was not one of agreement, and for that, I suppose I should have felt relief, but it was also not one of resistance. His gaze dropped to his plate, lingered on the rim of his wine glass, flitted across the table as though hoping someone else might intervene and erase the moment for him. His silence seemed to carry an almost pleading weight. If he ignored it, maybe it would vanish. If he refused to respond, maybe no one would remember. But I remembered. I remembered in the way a wound remembers the knife, not because the weapon remains inside you, but because the absence it leaves behind is permanent. I told myself later, as we walked to the car in the chill of the evening, that perhaps he had not known how to respond. Perhaps his loyalty was divided, stretched thin between the woman he claimed to love and the friend who had known him longer than I had, whose approval had shaped so much of his adult life. But those excuses could not erase the raw truth of what had happened. When tested, he had chosen silence, and silence is not neutral. It is a weapon wielded by inaction. The silence validated the insult, gave it room to breathe, allowed it to linger in the air, until it became not just his friend's opinion, but an unchallenged possibility. What is more difficult to endure than an enemy's cruelty is a lover's hesitation. In those seconds, sitting at that table with my face composed though my heart raged, I realized that loyalty is not measured by the grand gestures of affection, but by the smallest reflexes of defense. I had been exposed, humiliated in a room full of strangers who might one day become family or colleagues, and the man beside me, whose presence I had thought would steady me, had let the storm pass as though it were weather we could all ignore. His eyes had carried shame, not at me, but at the situation itself, the shame of conflict, the shame of discomfort. He feared disruption more than he feared the wound left by his friend's words, and so he chose the easier silence, forgetting that silence can sometimes cut deeper than speech. In the days that followed, I carried that look with me. I replayed it while brushing my teeth in the morning, while stirring my coffee at the counter, while staring out the window at the world moving indifferently along. It was not just a look. It was a fracture, a revelation of how he measured worth, and where I stood in the balance between his comfort and my dignity. Each time I thought of it, I felt again the tightening in my chest, the way my throat had ached with the words I refused to let spill, the way my fingers had gripped the edge of the table to keep myself anchored. And every time I relived it, I told myself the same thing: I will not be undone by silence. The look taught me something essential, something I had not wanted to learn but now could not forget, that in this world, even those who love you can falter at the moment you need them most. And when they falter, you must decide whether to collapse with them or to stand alone. I chose that night the quiet path of survival. I chose to meet his silence with my own. But mine was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a ledger being written, a record of debts to be repaid. For every second he sat still, every flicker of his gaze that avoided mine, I was etching lines into that ledger, not to wield in cruelty, but to hold as evidence of what I would never again overlook. There is a peculiar cruelty in watching the person you love shrink in front of you, not because they do not care, but because they cannot summon the courage to prove they do. It reduces the space between you, hollows out the ground beneath your intimacy, leaving behind a strange and fragile emptiness. When I looked at him in the days after, I saw not only the man I loved, but also the man who had once looked away, and I wondered if that look would haunt me forever. Even if he tried to fill the silence with apologies, with gestures, with words that came too late. Yet, within that hurt, a seed was planted. Pain has a way of clarifying what love often clouds. His silence reminded me of something I had once promised myself long before him, long before I thought I could be broken by another's hesitation, that I would never allow someone else's fear to determine my worth. His friend had aimed the arrow, but it was his silence that drove it deeper. And as much as it hurt, it sharpened me, honed me, reminded me that strength is not the absence of wounds, but the refusal to let them define you. That look, the silence that followed, became the cornerstone of what I would do next. It no longer mattered only that his best friend had humiliated me. What mattered now was that the man I trusted most had let it stand. I would not confront him with tears or accusations. I would not beg him to defend me belatedly. Instead, I would carry that look with me as a reminder, not of weakness, but of resolve. His silence had shown me the true nature of the battlefield, and I would not step onto it unprepared again. The silence that hurt me more than words became the silence that fueled me. In his hesitation, I found my clarity, and in my clarity, I found the first stirrings of a strength that would not only endure, but eventually turn the tables. He did not know it then, but the game had already shifted, and it was no longer his friend who held the power at that table. It was me, because I had seen the truth behind both cruelty and hesitation, and once you see truth, you cannot unsee it. You can only decide what to do with it. I lay awake that night, the memory of the dinner looping endlessly in my mind, every detail sharper now than it had been in the moment. The table, the wine stains on the cloth, the sound of laughter breaking uncomfortably after his friend's words, the way the candlelight flickered against his face as he looked away instead of at me, all of it replayed like a cruel theater I could not escape. The ache inside me was heavy, like something lodged under my ribs, not sharp enough to scream but steady enough to keep me from rest. In those hours of silence, as his steady breathing beside me reminded me that he could sleep despite it all, I made a choice that would mark the rest of everything that followed. I decided I would not cry. Tears would have been easy, natural even, but tears have a way of transforming pain into pity, and I refused to allow myself to be pitied. Pity belongs to those who yield to humiliation, and humiliation, if left untouched, has the power to crystallize into something else entirely. So instead of crying, I began to observe, carefully, clinically, as though I were stepping outside myself and watching from a distance. Observation is a kind of armor. The moment you step back and begin to record instead of react, you change the rules of the game. That night, I began to reconstruct the evening not as a victim, but as a witness. And with each reconstruction, I noticed details I had overlooked before. The best friend's smirk as he leaned back in his chair, the way he tested his words on the room before delivering them at me like a weapon, the ripple of discomfort among the others, and the precise second in which my boyfriend's eyes fell not on me, but on his glass of wine. Each fragment told a story, and when pieced together, the story was not just of one man's cruelty, but of a dynamic I had stepped into without fully realizing its contours. This was not merely about me. It was about power, loyalty, and the hierarchies that men construct among themselves, hierarchies I was expected to either quietly endure or be crushed beneath. The coldness of my decision steadied me. I realized that if I continued to see myself as someone wounded, I would stay trapped in that chair at that table forever, reliving the insult and the silence until it became my whole identity. But if I treated it as evidence, as something to be studied, I could transform it into fuel. I did not want to react. I wanted to prepare. The difference is subtle but immense. Reaction gives power to the offender. Preparation claims it back. I thought of my face in that moment at dinner, how I had smiled faintly and sipped my water instead of shrinking. That small act had already shifted the balance, even if no one else noticed. I had refused to give them the satisfaction of my collapse, and now I would refuse to give them the satisfaction of my tears. Over the days that followed, my role shifted inwardly. I listened more closely when he spoke about his friends, especially that best friend whose influence now cast such a long shadow over our relationship. I noticed the way his stories were laced with loyalty, with unspoken gratitude for years of shared struggles, as though that friendship had been a foundation he feared to disturb. I watched how his phone would light up with messages late into the night, and how he would laugh at them quietly, before turning back to me with a practiced softness that now felt almost rehearsed. I did not accuse him. I did not demand explanations. Instead, I filed everything away, careful not to reveal how my perception was changing. I was no longer simply a partner trying to fit into his world. I was an observer, cataloging every fracture and every silence, preparing to understand the structure of a house before deciding whether to burn it down or rebuild it. There were moments when my resolve wavered, when the weight of what had been said pressed too hard against my chest, and I wanted nothing more than to scream at him, to demand why he had let me sit there under the weight of those words without a shield. But each time the urge came, I reminded myself of the decision I had made. No tears, no rage, only observation. Anger would have been fleeting, leaving me exhausted and vulnerable. But observation sharpened me, gave me clarity I had never had before. It was like training my eyes to adjust to the dark. The longer I stared into the discomfort, the more I could see. He noticed, eventually, that something in me had shifted. He would search my face during conversations, his eyes filled with that quiet question lovers ask when they feel distance they cannot explain. He asked if I was upset, if I was angry at him, but I smiled and shook my head, telling him I was simply tired. He accepted the lie because it was easier than pressing further, but I saw the flicker of unease in his expression. It was not unease at what his friend had said. It was unease at the silence I was holding. He had expected a storm, perhaps, and he had braced himself for it. But when the storm never came, he was left adrift in an even greater uncertainty. That uncertainty was mine to wield now, and though I did not yet know how, I sensed its power. Observation, after all, is not passive. It is the first stage of strategy. I began to notice patterns not only in him but in his best friend too. The way arrogance often disguises insecurity. The way cruelty is a mask for fear of irrelevance. The words "he could do so much better than you" no longer rang in my ears as a simple insult. They revealed something deeper, a need to assert dominance, to remind me that I was being measured against a standard I had not agreed to, but was nonetheless expected to meet. By refusing to react, I had already disrupted that measurement. Now, my task was to continue observing until I found the crack large enough to pry open. And so I moved through those days in a strange duality, outwardly calm, even affectionate, but inwardly sharpening myself with every detail. I smiled at dinners. I laughed at stories. I brushed his arm as though nothing had changed. But in my mind I was recording everything. The cadence of his friend's influence, the softness of his excuses, the tension that rose whenever the subject of that dinner hovered too close to the surface. I did not allow myself to dwell on hurt anymore. Hurt is a feeling, and feelings fade. What I held on to instead was the evidence, and evidence, when arranged correctly, becomes unshakable. The cold decision I had made not to cry was not just about dignity. It was about survival. Tears wash pain away, but they also erase the sharpness of memory. By refusing them, I kept everything intact, crystal clear, ready to be used when the time was right. It was not the choice of a victim. It was the choice of someone preparing for war, though I did not yet know what shape that war would take. All I knew was that I would not forget. I would not forgive easily, and I would not allow silence to be the last word in my story. The shift from simply enduring to truly understanding came slowly, like a fog lifting not all at once but in increments, revealing shapes and outlines where before there had only been shadow. I had decided to observe, to measure, instead of to react, and as days passed, that decision began to pay its dividends. It was not in dramatic revelations or confessions, but in the quiet spaces between words, the unguarded moments when he spoke of his best friend, when he laughed at stories from their youth, when his eyes softened with nostalgia that I was never a part of. It was there, in those fragments, that I began to see the truth of their history, and with it, the explanation for why his silence that night had weighed so heavily against me. The roots of their bond went far deeper than I had realized, and with each detail I uncovered, I understood that I was not only contending with one man's cruelty, but with an entire past that chained them together. It started with casual recollections, tales from their school days, nights spent drinking on rooftops, reckless adventures that ended in bruises or laughter, depending on the telling. At first, I dismissed them as the usual anecdotes of a long friendship, the kind people carry with them like trinkets in their pocket, polished and retold until they shine. But then I began to notice a pattern. In every story, his best friend was the one who pushed, who dared, who led, while he was the one who followed, who obeyed, who carried the consequences with a nervous laugh. Their dynamic was not built on equality, but on dominance and submission, an invisible leash woven from years of unspoken obligation. And now, I saw that leash still wrapped tightly around him, tightening whenever his friend tugged at it with words disguised as jokes or truths. The more I listened, the clearer it became. That comment at dinner, the one that had torn through me, was not an isolated cruelty. It was the continuation of a script that had been rehearsed for years. His friend had always been the arbiter of worth, the one who measured everyone against his own shifting standards, and my boyfriend had always accepted those judgments as if they were carved into stone. I began to understand that when he stayed silent that night, it was not because he agreed, nor because he was indifferent, but because he had been trained through years of history not to oppose him. To oppose him would be to unravel decades of loyalty, to question the very foundation of who he believed himself to be. And in that realization, I felt both clarity and fury. Clarity, because I now knew the truth of what I was facing. It was not simply a cruel man testing me, but a cruel man who had been allowed to rule unchecked for so long that he believed himself untouchable. Fury, because I realized my boyfriend's silence was not an accident, not a moment of weakness, but the reflex of someone who had been conditioned to yield. In that conditioning, I was collateral damage. I was not only fighting for my dignity, I was fighting against a history that had already decided where I belonged. It was in the smallest details that the depth of their past revealed itself. The way he said his friend's name with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. The way he repeated his phrases as though they carried a weight greater than ordinary words. The way he always included him in future plans, as though no decision could be made without his shadow looming over it. I began to ask quiet questions, never accusatory, just curious. How did they meet? What did they go through? Why did he matter so much? And the answers, though simple on the surface, always led back to the same truth. His best friend had been there in every defining moment of his life, shaping him, steering him, and most importantly, reminding him who held the power. There was one evening in particular when the pieces clicked together with brutal clarity. We were at home, the television humming in the background, when he told me a story about a girl he had once dated briefly in college. He mentioned her almost in passing, but what struck me was not the story itself, but the way he laughed at the memory of how his friend had mocked her, had called her unworthy, and how he had broken things off not because he wanted to, but because his friend had insisted she was beneath him. He told it as though it were a funny anecdote, something silly from the past, but I sat there in silence, my fingers tightening around my glass, realizing that history had just repeated itself. The same script, the same cruelty, the same silence, only now I was the girl being weighed and dismissed. That night I understood something essential. I was not fighting only for his love, for his respect, but for his independence from a man who had dictated the terms of his relationships for as long as he could remember. The insult at dinner had not been about me at all. It had been about control. His friend had tested him, had thrown down the gauntlet to see if he would obey as he always had, and by staying silent, he had proven that he still belonged to him. The realization burned, not just because of what it meant for me, but because it meant that until he broke free of that leash, he would never truly be mine, no matter how softly he whispered, "I love you," in the dark. I did not confront him that night. Confrontation would have been useless, a flame against a fortress built from years of obedience. Instead, I added it to the ledger I was keeping, the careful record of words and silences, of actions and inactions. But I also made a second decision, quieter than the first, and just as cold. I would no longer see myself as the victim of a cruel remark. I would see myself as the intruder in a game much older than me, a game of dominance and loyalty. And if I wanted to survive it, I would have to learn the rules. His best friend had humiliated me because he believed I was nothing more than another girl to be dismissed. He believed history would repeat itself, that his words would be law, and that silence would do the rest. But history is only unbreakable until someone refuses to follow the script, and I had no intention of being written out so easily. The discovery of their past did not weaken me. It armed me. I now knew the shape of the enemy, the depth of the chains that bound him, and the arrogance of the man who thought himself untouchable. I carried that knowledge like a hidden blade, unseen but ready, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough, when strategy would need to become action. Because if there is one thing more dangerous than cruelty, it is cruelty mistaken for tradition, and I had no intention of allowing their history to dictate my future. Once I uncovered the depth of their past, the invisible leash of loyalty that bound him to his best friend, I knew that simple confrontation would be futile. Words alone would not sever bonds woven through decades of shared history, nor could I demand that he rise against someone who had shaped so much of his identity. If I shouted, if I accused, if I made ultimatums, I would only be written off as another jealous girlfriend, another weak link that his friend could smirk about later, another story to fold into their archive of dismissals. What I needed was not to challenge him with fury, but to challenge them both with reflection. I needed a mirror, one that would not show my pain but my value, undeniable and luminous, something that could not be erased by a cruel sentence tossed at dinner. And so, The first step of revenge took root in me, not the kind that sought to destroy in flames, but the kind that revealed truth so starkly that it could no longer be ignored. The idea was simple, though not easy. If his friend had belittled me by suggesting he could do better, then I would show them both what better looked like. Not through desperate attempts to please, not by clinging or begging for approval, but by living in a way so expansive, so undeniably radiant, that the contrast between their perception of me and the reality would gnaw at them every time they saw me. My revenge would not be a scene, a fight, or a spectacle. It would be the subtle erosion of their narrative, the steady dismantling of their assumptions, until the reflection they faced was one of their own inadequacy, not mine. I began with myself. I poured into my work with a focus I had not embraced before, not out of fear of losing him, but out of a refusal to let their judgment define me. Each project I took on, each accomplishment I collected, became part of a mosaic I was building, a picture of someone who was not fragile, not dependent, but whole and formidable on her own. I did not flaunt these victories in his face, nor did I throw them online for validation. Instead, I let them exist quietly but undeniably, so that when the time came, their weight would be felt not in words, but in presence. At the same time, I sharpened the edges of my social life. Where before I had been hesitant, cautious of appearing too independent, I now leaned into the strength of my own circles. I reconnected with friends who had drifted away, joined gatherings that filled me with joy, and allowed myself to be seen outside of him. Photos emerged, not staged, not desperate, but natural captures of a life being lived fully, surrounded by people who valued me. Slowly, I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes when he scrolled through them, when he realized that I was not waiting passively for his defense or his approval. That unease was the first crack in the armor of silence, the first glimmer that perhaps he had underestimated me. Perhaps his friend had too. The mirror of truth I was crafting became even clearer during one particular evening. We attended a gathering together, a work-related event of mine where I was not just someone's girlfriend but the centerpiece of the room. I spoke with confidence, shared insights, laughed with colleagues who respected me, and for once, he was the one standing slightly behind, watching. His best friend was not there physically, but I knew, with an almost chilling certainty, that word of this evening would reach him. Because men like that, men who wield control through dominance, thrive on the illusion that their judgments are absolute, and nothing unsettles them more than proof that they were wrong. What struck me most was not his pride in me that evening, it was his discomfort. Pride can be feigned, discomfort cannot. He clapped for me, smiled when others congratulated me, but his eyes told a different story. Confusion, unease, the dawning awareness that the woman sitting quietly at that dinner, the one he had failed to defend, was not the fragile figure his friend had dismissed. I could see it in his shifting stance, the way he held his glass a little tighter, the way his laugh came half a second too late. The mirror of truth was being held up, and though he did not yet know how to look at it, he could not ignore its reflection. But revenge, I realized, was not only about him. It was about the best friend too, the man whose words had pierced me, who believed that one cruel sentence could reduce me to nothing. I knew he would hear of my progress, my growing presence, my quiet successes. I knew he would dismiss them at first, perhaps with another smirk, perhaps with another offhand comment meant to diminish me. But the thing about mirrors is that you cannot stop them from reflecting. With each story that reached him, with each moment he realized his judgment had failed, the reflection would grow harsher. He would be forced to see that his cruelty had not diminished me, but had carved out a space where I could only grow stronger. What made this revenge so potent was its silence. I did not announce it, did not declare it. I let it unfold in shadows and reflections, so subtle that neither of them could name it outright, but both of them could feel it pressing in. It was not a strike, not a battle. It was erosion, quiet and relentless, reshaping the ground beneath them until they could no longer stand as firmly as they once did. And as I watched it unfold, I realized that the mirror of truth was not only for them, it was for me as well. Because in living fully, in proving myself not through defense, but through existence. I saw reflected back a woman who no longer needed their approval, a woman whose value was not up for debate at any table, in any conversation, under any cruel remark. The first step of revenge, then, was not about them at all. It was about me refusing to shrink into the version of myself they wanted me to be. It was about choosing to expand, to glow, to thrive so fully that their words dissolved into irrelevance. And in doing so, I held up a mirror they could not look away from. In that mirror, they saw not a woman who was less than, but men who were failing to rise to her side. That truth would haunt them far longer than any shouted retaliation ever could. The mirror of truth, once raised, does not easily lower itself, and it is not only those being reflected who struggle with the vision, but also those around them who must confront what they had long chosen to ignore. What began as a quiet shift within me soon spread outward, rippling through the fragile dynamics of his friendships. Those bonds of laughter and loyalty that seemed so unshakable until they were tested by the simple presence of a woman who refused to collapse. I had not plotted for it to happen this way, but inevitability has its own rhythm, and once the current began, I could only stand in the center of it, calm and steady, while the waves tore at the structures they thought would last forever. It started subtly, as most fractures do. His friends who had once looked at me with curiosity tinged by their leader's disapproval began to change in tone. Some of them, perhaps tired of always bending to the arrogance of his best friend, found in me a quiet defiance that resonated with their own unspoken grievances. They smiled more openly at me, engaged with me without the caution of eyes flickering toward him for permission. At gatherings, when the best friend tried to dominate conversations with his usual bravado, I noticed small exchanges, raised eyebrows, restrained sighs, glances that lingered too long, as though his cruelty no longer carried the same weight it once did. It was as if my refusal to break had illuminated something they had all endured in silence, and now that light could not be dimmed. The first true rupture came one evening when we all found ourselves at a bar, one of those dimly lit places thick with noise and the smell of spilled liquor, where groups of friends retreat to repeat old stories as if repetition will make them immortal. The best friend was in his element, of course, laughing loudly, gesturing expansively, his words filling every space. And then, as though unable to resist, he turned his gaze to me once more, some thinly veiled jab about my work, my appearance, something meant to remind me, and everyone else, that I was still on trial. But this time, before I could even shape a response, another voice cut through, one of his own. A man who had always lingered on the edges of their group spoke sharply. "You know, not every word you speak is gospel. Maybe you should let people prove themselves before you tear them down." The silence that followed was different from the one at dinner. This was not the silence of complicity, but the silence of shock, of walls beginning to tremble. I sat still, my face calm, but inside, I felt the ground shifting. The best friend laughed it off at first, trying to sweep it away with a joke, but the words had landed, and the others felt it too. The dynamic had cracked, and no amount of bravado could erase the fact that one of his own had broken ranks. From that night on, the group was no longer unified under his dominance. It had begun to splinter, and the fracture only deepened as my presence continued to unsettle the balance. The tension grew heavier with each encounter. My boyfriend, caught between the loyalty of a past that demanded obedience and the growing respect that others were showing me, began to fray at the edges. I watched him closely, his nervous laughter, his attempts to smooth conversations, the way his eyes darted between me and his friend as though he were standing in the middle of a fault line, waiting for the ground to give way. And I realized something that both terrified and thrilled me. This was no longer my battle alone. My silence, my strength, had set into motion a conflict that would unravel them from within, and all I had to do was keep holding that mirror steady. The best friend, of course, sensed the shift. Men like him can smell defiance the way wolves smell blood, and his arrogance turned sharper, more desperate. He began to push harder, his jokes growing crueler, his attempts to undermine me more obvious, as though by amplifying his cruelty he could reassert control. But cruelty, when overplayed, exposes itself, and the others began to see what I had seen all along, that his dominance was not built on strength, but on intimidation, not on respect, but on fear. The more he pushed, The more he revealed, and the more the group recoiled from him. One night, as we all sat together again, the fracture became undeniable. A disagreement broke out, not about me, not even about relationships, but about something trivial, a choice of vacation plans, of all things. Yet beneath that triviality, years of resentment boiled over, voices raised, accusations spilled out, and suddenly the air was thick with confessions that had long been buried. "You always think you're better than everyone," one said. "You've been tearing people down for years," another added. The best friend, red-faced and indignant, fought back with venom, but the tide had turned. His power was no longer absolute. The group that had once orbited him was pulling away, their voices no longer whispers in the dark, but open defiance in the light. I did not speak much that night. I did not need to. I sat there, calm and composed, watching as the storm raged around me, understanding that the mirror I had raised was now reflecting not only me, but them. They were forced to see themselves, to see him, to see the truth of what they had endured and ignored for so long. The humiliation he had tried to pin on me had returned to him, magnified by the voices of those who once followed him without question. And through it all, my boyfriend sat in silence again. But this time the silence was not passive. It was broken, shattered, because he could no longer pretend not to see. When the night ended, when people left in fractured groups, their laughter hollow and forced, I felt an odd sense of calm. The conflict had not been of my making, not directly, but it had been inevitable once I refused to collapse. Their loyalty to him was crumbling, their tolerance for his cruelty evaporating, and he was left standing exposed, the emperor without clothes, the tyrant without subjects. And my boyfriend, the man whose silence had once wounded me most of all, was beginning to realize that silence could no longer shield him either. He would have to choose, and when he did, the foundation of everything they had built together would never be the same again. The conflict that shattered the group from within was not a war fought with grand battles, but with the quiet insistence of truth, reflected again and again until it became unbearable. And as I lay awake afterward, listening once more to the sound of his breathing beside me, I knew that the cracks were only the beginning. What had broken could never be rebuilt in the same shape, and from here on, the ground beneath all of us would only continue to shift. There comes a point when what has been simmering in private inevitably spills into the open, when whispered doubts and quiet fractures can no longer remain contained within the walls of late-night bars or hushed conversations in dimly lit corners. The conflict that had begun to splinter his group of friends was already reshaping the ground beneath them, but it was still something they could pretend to control, still something they could attempt to plaster over with excuses and half-hearted laughter. Yet truth has a way of demanding light, and the moment came sooner than any of us expected, on a night meant for celebration, when the stage was set not by me, but by circumstance. It was there, before an audience larger than the circle of friends who had grown accustomed to silence, that the mask finally cracked, and the scene unfolded with a precision I could not have orchestrated better if I had tried. It was at a mutual friend's engagement party, a glittering event full of clinking glasses, polished shoes, and smiles stretched wide across faces eager to display joy. The kind of event where appearances matter more than truth, where every gesture is rehearsed for an audience, where the air hums with the tension of people wanting to be seen as more than they are. I arrived with him at my side, dressed carefully, carrying myself with the quiet confidence I had been cultivating for weeks. I knew the best friend would be there. He was always there, circling every milestone like a hawk, unwilling to miss a chance to reassert himself. And I knew, too, that the eyes watching that night would not only be those of friends, but of colleagues, acquaintances, even strangers, people whose judgments mattered in the way that social currency always does. From the beginning of the evening, the best friend carried himself with the same arrogance, laughing louder than anyone else, speaking over conversations, positioning himself as the gravitational center of the room. But I noticed the cracks already forming. The others who had once orbited him so easily now drifted further away, engaging with me in conversations, acknowledging me with a warmth that had been absent at first. He noticed it too, though he masked it behind jokes, behind the same tired bravado. But arrogance grows restless when ignored, and it was only a matter of time before he sought to remind everyone of his power. The moment came when we were gathered near the center of the room, champagne glasses raised for a toast to the couple. Laughter and clapping still echoed when he leaned in with that smirk I had come to know too well and delivered another of his cutting remarks, this time louder, crafted not only for me, but for the ears of everyone nearby. Something about how I had come a long way from being just a pretty face at his table. The words sharpened into the blade of a joke, his tone exaggerated enough to elicit laughter from those too polite or too nervous to refuse. It was meant to diminish me, to fold me neatly back into the narrative he had been trying to write since that first dinner, the narrative of someone unworthy, someone lucky to have a place at all. But this time the stage was larger, the audience broader, and the reflection of truth could not be contained. I did not flinch. Instead, I smiled, not at him, but at the crowd, and with a voice steady and calm, I answered in a way that shifted the air in the room. I spoke not with anger, not with defense, but with simple fact, recounting briefly an accomplishment from earlier that week, a recognition I had received in my field, one that many in the room already knew of. My words were measured, delivered with the grace of someone who does not need to shout, because the truth already carries its own weight. And then, with a soft laugh, I added, "Funny how people confuse their own insecurities for reality." The effect was immediate. Laughter, yes, but not directed at me, directed at him. The crowd turned, the smirks no longer supporting him but exposing him, and for the first time his power faltered in public. His face flushed, his words caught in his throat, and though he attempted to brush it off, the room had shifted. No longer was he the one holding the audience. It was me. In that instant, everything I had been building, the mirror of truth, the quiet strength, the refusal to collapse, culminated in exposure he could not escape. He had tried to reduce me with words, but words cannot undo presence, cannot erase the weight of truth when it is reflected back by an entire room. I watched as he faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of eyes that no longer adored him, but judged him. My boyfriend, standing beside me, shifted uneasily, caught between the loyalty of his past and the undeniable reality of the present. He looked at me with something new in his expression, not just affection, not just regret, but recognition, as though seeing me fully for the first time, as though understanding that the silence he had once offered could no longer contain me. Around us, the group dynamics continued to unravel. Those who had already begun to distance themselves from his friend now did so openly, emboldened by the shift they had witnessed. Conversations moved away from him, laughter excluded him, and though he tried to insert himself back into the center, his words rang hollow, stripped of the authority they once carried. That night, the public exposure was not a single scene but a cascade of moments, each one pulling threads loose until the fabric of his dominance tore. And in the midst of it all, I remained calm, steady, unflinching. I had not plotted this exact confrontation, but I had prepared myself for it in every decision I had made since that first cruel remark. I had chosen not to cry, not to rage, but to reflect, to hold the mirror steady until the truth became too heavy to deny. And now, before an audience larger than any of us could control, that truth had done its work. When the evening ended and the crowd began to thin, I felt no need for triumph, no gloating satisfaction. The revenge I sought had never been about theatrics. It had been about shifting the balance, about proving that worth is not something handed down by the loudest voice in the room, but something that stands unshaken in the face of arrogance. And as I walked away, his best friend standing smaller than I had ever seen him, I knew that the scene had turned everything. The game was no longer his, the silence no longer mine. The truth was out, and nothing could return to the way it had been. In the days that followed the engagement party, the atmosphere around us seemed to change in ways both subtle and undeniable. I could feel it in the pauses that stretched longer during our conversations, in the way he lingered at the doorway before leaving for work, in the restless way his fingers tapped against the steering wheel when we drove in silence. Something had shifted irreversibly that night, not only between me and his best friend, but within the entire structure of his loyalties. The exposure had been public, humiliating in a way his best friend could not easily laugh off. And though he tried to plaster over the cracks with the same old arrogance, the truth had settled in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, he was no longer the unquestioned center of gravity. And for the man I loved, caught between that crumbling empire and the woman who had stood unflinching in its ruins, the moment of choice had finally arrived. I did not force it. I did not demand that he choose me over him. I knew better than to hand him ultimatums, for ultimatums often breed resentment and hollow compliance. Instead, I gave him silence. Not the silence of wounded resignation that I had endured after that first dinner, but a silence filled with patience, with the weight of inevitability. I had held up the mirror. Now he would have to decide what reflection he could live with. Would he remain tethered to a friendship that had defined him, shaped him, and silenced him for so long? Or would he step into the unfamiliar, terrifying freedom of standing on his own, with me beside him? At first, he tried to pretend nothing had changed. He spoke of his friend with forced lightness, as though the rupture had been exaggerated, as though the sting of humiliation would fade with time. But I could see it in his eyes, the doubt that gnawed at him, the recognition he tried to bury. He asked me one evening, while we sat on the couch surrounded by the muted glow of the television, if I hated his friend. I answered carefully, with the truth. No, I said softly. I don't hate him. I hate what he makes you forget about yourself. He didn't reply, but the way his shoulders tightened, the way his breath caught for a moment, told me the words had landed. The following weeks unfolded like a quiet tug of war. His friend reached out more often, demanding dinners, late-night drinks, any excuse to pull him back into the orbit where he could still assert control. And I watched him falter, torn between habit and awareness, between comfort and courage. Sometimes he went, returning home with that restless guilt that made him pace the room before finally collapsing into silence. Other times he declined, and I would catch him staring out the window, as though questioning whether he was betraying something larger than himself. It was not me he was afraid of betraying. It was the version of himself that had always bowed his head in that friendship. The cracks widened one night when his friend called while we were together, his voice spilling through the speaker, sharp and demanding. I listened as he laughed too loudly, then lowered his tone to a sneer, accusing him of being different now, of being changed since I came along. The accusation hung heavy, and I saw the conflict writ large across his face. When he hung up, his eyes met mine, and for the first time he did not look away. He thinks you've taken me from him, he said quietly. I shook my head. I didn't take you, I replied. But maybe it's time you decide who you really are without him telling you. That night, the silence between us was not heavy, but raw, filled with unspoken truths, finally pressing against the surface. I could feel his struggle as if it were my own, the fear of losing someone who had always been there, the fear of stepping into a life no longer dictated by another's approval. But I also knew that growth requires loss, and loss demands choice. He could not keep us both in the same place, not anymore. The balance had tipped, and the world would not allow him to straddle it forever. The final choice revealed itself not in a grand confrontation, but in a moment of quiet clarity. We attended another gathering, smaller this time, with some of the same friends who had witnessed the exposure. His best friend arrived late, carrying himself with that forced confidence, eager to reclaim what had slipped away. But the room no longer belonged to him, and when he turned his remarks toward me again, seeking to test the waters, the silence that followed was not mine. It was theirs. No one laughed. No one nodded. Instead, they shifted uncomfortably, exchanged glances, and someone quickly changed the subject. He was left standing there, his words dangling, his authority drained away not by me, but by the reflection of everyone else finally seeing him for what he was. And it was then that I saw the shift in the man beside me. He did not remain silent. He did not laugh nervously or look away. He placed his hand on mine, steady and certain, and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Enough. That's enough." It was not dramatic, not theatrical, but it was final. In that small gesture, in those simple words, he made his choice. He had chosen to step away from the leash that had bound him, chosen to stand beside me, not as someone caught between two worlds, but as someone who had decided which one he belonged to. The aftermath was not clean, of course. His best friend stormed out, his pride too wounded to endure the loss of control. Whispers followed, rumors spread, and the group itself fractured beyond repair. But the choice had been made, and with it came a new kind of silence. Not the silence that had once wounded me, but the silence of release, the quiet that follows when a storm finally breaks, and the air is left heavy but clear. For him, the choice was a reckoning, the severing of a tie that had defined his life. For me, it was the confirmation of what I had always known, that true strength does not come from avoiding conflict, but from facing it, even when it means losing something once thought indispensable. And as we walked home that night, his hand still clasped in mine, I realized that my revenge had never been about humiliating his friend, not truly. It had been about forcing the reflection of truth until a decision could no longer be avoided. And now, with the choice made, the path ahead, whatever it held, would be ours alone to walk. There is a strange kind of quiet that follows resolution, not the heavy silence that presses like a weight against your chest, but the kind that opens like a wide horizon after a storm has passed. For so long I had been moving through shadows. First the shadow of his best friend's cruel remark, then the shadow of his silence, then the looming shadow of their shared past that seemed to dictate every step we took together. But when the choice was finally made, when he placed his hand over mine and said enough, with a voice steady enough to echo through the fractures of that group, I realized that I was no longer standing in anyone's shadow. I had stepped out into something brighter, not because the world had changed, but because I had changed within it. What followed was not triumph in the traditional sense, not a victory parade or a sense of conquest, but a quieter, deeper kind of rebirth, one where I no longer needed to measure myself against anyone's words, anyone's silence, or anyone's approval. In the weeks after, the remnants of that broken friendship still lingered like dust after demolition. There were calls left unanswered, messages filled with accusations and pleas, as though his best friend could not comprehend that the foundation he had stood upon for years had finally crumbled. My partner now, in the truest sense, struggled with the loss, but even in that struggle there was growth. I watched him mourn what had been, and I watched him rebuild himself without the leash of someone else's dominance around his neck. It was not easy. Grief rarely is, even when the thing lost was toxic. But each day he carried himself with more certainty, more independence, and though it pained him, I could see the man he was becoming, someone no longer bound to the patterns of his past. And as for me, I found that the sharp edges of humiliation had softened into something altogether different. That sentence, "He could do so much better than you," once carved into my memory like a scar, now felt less like a wound and more like a milestone. It marked the beginning of a journey I had not chosen, but had claimed nonetheless. A journey that taught me not to collapse under the weight of cruelty, but to stand, to observe, to reflect, and ultimately to rise. I realized that revenge, in the end, had never been about destruction. It had been about truth, about refusing to let someone else's narrative define me, and instead writing my own in actions, in presence, in the undeniable clarity of simply being more than they could ever diminish. I carried myself differently after that. Not because I wanted to prove anything to the ones who had doubted me, but because I no longer needed to. When I entered rooms, I no longer thought of whether I was being judged, measured, or dismissed. I thought only of what I brought with me, my strength, my accomplishments, my quiet resilience. It was not arrogance. It was freedom, the kind that comes when you realize you do not have to shrink to fit inside someone else's version of you. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a woman who had survived humiliation, but a woman who had been reborn through it, sharper, steadier, unshakable. The epilogue to this story is not one of grand gestures or dramatic finales. It is written in the small moments, the mornings when I wake without the weight of doubt pressing against me, the evenings when we sit together and laugh with an ease we had not known before, the days when I walk into my work with my head high, knowing that my worth does not rest in anyone else's hands. It is written in the way his friends treat me now, not with the cautious politeness of before, but with respect. genuine, and unforced. It is written in the way he looks at me, no longer with hesitation, but with recognition, as though he finally understands not only who I am, but who he can be beside me. And yet, the most important part of this rebirth is not about him, or them, or even us. It is about me reclaiming myself. There is a kind of strength that only comes when you are forced to see yourself through the eyes of those who try to belittle you and still choose to stand taller. There is a kind of clarity that only arrives when silence wounds you, and instead of letting it drown you, you learn to fill it with your own voice, your own truth, your own presence. I do not regret what happened, though it burned me at the time. I do not wish to erase it, though it cut me deeply, for without it, I might never have discovered the quiet resilience that now defines me, the unshakable confidence that hums beneath my skin like a pulse I can always rely on. So here is where the story ends, not with bitterness, but with rebirth. The man who once failed to defend me now stands beside me, no longer bound by someone else's dominance. The group that once tolerated cruelty now knows the cost of silence. And I, the woman who was told I was not enough, have discovered that I am more than enough, not because I needed to prove it to them, but because I finally proved it to myself. That is the true revenge, the one no cruel remark can undo, the one no silence can weaken. To rise, to thrive, to live so fully that their words fade into nothing more than echoes in a story that belongs, and will always belong, to me.